Death House landlady, Elena Walsh. 1426 F Street. A quiet, ordinary neighborhood in Sacramento. A two-story, blue-painted Victorian house that drew no one's attention. Roses in the front yard, vegetable seedlings on the side, and inside, a woman in her 60s, Helena Walsh. Someone everyone called the compassionate landlady. But everything changed in November 1988. When a social worker knocked on her door looking for a missing man with intellectual disabilities, the earth began to speak. As the police began digging up the back garden, the first body was found. Then another, and another. A total of 7 corpses had been quietly buried. Each one was a poor, elderly, destitute person entrusted to the state's welfare system. When the first body was exhumed, Helena Walsh stood at her doorstep. She adjusted her glasses and said in a calm voice, "This is all a misunderstanding. But the earth has a memory." And that day, it was revealed that this beautiful house had become the burial ground of one of the most cold-blooded serial killers in American history. Helena Walsh was always known in the neighborhood as a kind, helpful, and affectionate woman. This elderly woman with graying hair, who wore glasses and floral dresses, who watered the roses in her garden every day, seemed like a refuge for the poor and elderly on Sacramento's F Street. She would give hot meals to the homeless, take in elderly people on state benefits, and offer shelter in her boarding house for just a few $100s. She even brought toys or cookies to her neighbors for their grandchildren. No one in the neighborhood had a bad word to say about her. She went to church, wrote letters to local politicians, and sent thank you cards to municipal workers. So much so that some local officials had even posed for photos with her at charity events. Most of the people who stayed at Walsh's house had serious problems like mental illness, alcohol addiction, or physical disabilities. These people, abandoned by the system, were a source of profit for her. But no one looking from the outside could notice this. Because Walsh played her role masterfully. She built trust with social workers, obtained permission to collect the tenants' benefit checks and conduct banking on their behalf, and opened new accounts using their names with fake IDs. While doing all this, she always presented a calm, elegant, gentle face. In the background, she was erasing their traces so thoroughly that their disappearances wouldn't even be noticed. While her neighbors believed she was a good Samaritan, she was extinguishing lives with sedatives in the back rooms. Her greatest shield was being an elderly woman and appearing harmless. In the eyes of society, the idea that an old woman could commit such a crime was almost impossible, and Walsh used this perception to the fullest. While presenting herself as the embodiment of compassion, she had in fact become someone who exploited loneliness and desperation, killing people in need of help. Helena Gray was born on January 9, 1929, in California, into a poor and troubled family. Her father was a carpenter but a severe alcoholic. He would often frighten his children by saying he would kill himself at home. He died of tuberculosis in 1937. Her mother was also an alcoholic and lived an unstable life, unable to care for her family. There are records suggesting she worked as a sex worker for a period. When her mother died in a motorcycle accident in 1938, Helena and her siblings were left completely parentless. At just 9 years old, she was placed in California's orphanage system, where she suffered severe neglect and abuse. It was even alleged that she was sexually abused. This period laid the foundation for the emotional damage she would carry for life. At 16, she married a soldier named Frederick Moore, who was older than her. At 17, she gave birth to her first child. Then came a second child. But unprepared for the role of motherhood, Walsh gave one of her children to relatives and left the other for adoption. When she was 19, her husband left her, and she had to manage life on her own. Her first crime was writing a bad check in 1948. She was caught trying to cash a check under a false name at a bank in Sacramento and served 6 months in prison. After this period, identity fraud became a systematic habit in Walsh's life. By the 1960s, it emerged that she was secretly running a brothel in Sacramento, and she was arrested for pandering. That same year, she was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital due to excessive alcohol consumption, identity fraud, and forgery. Evaluations there diagnosed her with mythomania, pathological lying. Doctors noted she had impulse control disorder and that her personality structure was manipulative, deceitful, and emotionally shallow. Medical records revealed that Walsh's perception of reality was sometimes distorted and that she had a tendency to rationalize her crimes. After being released from the hospital, in 1966, she began actions such as tricking elderly men with promises of marriage to transfer their assets to her. For a time, she carried out serial frauds targeting elderly and lonely men. She would move into their homes, take their checks, and then make them disappear. In one trial, it was determined she had transferred an old man's assets to herself, and she was sentenced to 3 years in prison. But she was released after serving only 18 months. After getting out of prison, she tried to rebuild her reputation in the eyes of the community. She went to church, worked with charities, and voluntarily looked after elderly people on social benefits. Beneath this appearance, the deceptions, aliases, and manipulative behaviors from her past had never disappeared. She systematically identified elderly, lonely, destitute individuals, looking for ways to divert their state benefits to herself. She gained their information by building trust relationships with social workers. This dual lifestyle showed she was an architect of crime, creating suitable conditions for much darker actions in the coming years. Helena Walsh was gradually breaching society's walls of trust, transforming from an innocent landlady into a deadly planner. Her past is a dark example of how a child's survival instinct can, over time, evolve into ruthless power and a false identity. Helena Walsh's name was first linked to a death in April 1982. At that time, Walsh was making a living by renting out rooms in her Sacramento house and had also started sharing her home with 61-year-old Ruth Morrison, who was also a close friend. Ruth was a grieving woman in need of support who had recently lost her husband. Helena had invited her to her own home, saying she shouldn't be alone. Just 3 weeks after moving into one of the upstairs rooms, Ruth suddenly fell ill and deteriorated. The cause of death was a high-dose mixture of the prescription drug codeine and diazepam. Forensic officials, citing the woman's history of depression, classified this as a suicide or accident. No investigation was opened against Walsh. However, Ruth's sons claimed the incident was suspicious, saying their mother was never prone to suicide. The truth would only be understood years later when other deaths emerged. Just weeks after Ruth Morrison's death, Walsh was caught for another crime. She was taking in elderly people on social benefits, incapacitating them with drugs, and stealing their checks for her own expenses. Caught for this crime, Walsh received another 3-year prison sentence for elder abuse and check fraud. When she was released in 1985, she was much more careful, planned, and target-oriented. Everson Gilmore, a 77-year-old retired man with whom she had started corresponding shortly before she went to prison, was eagerly awaiting her release. Everson Gilmore lived in Oregon and had become emotionally attached to Helena during their correspondence. After Helena got out of prison, Everson Gilmore came to Sacramento to live with her. Walsh introduced Gilmore as her fiancé. She told those around her they were planning to marry. But no further news was heard from the man. On January 1, 1986, a large, heavy wooden crate had been found on the banks of the Sacramento River. Inside the crate was a badly wrapped, decomposing male corpse. The body had no identification, and its hands, wallet, and dental records were missing. Therefore, its identity could not be determined. Walsh could not explain the sudden disappearance of Everson Gilmore, with whom she had been living at the time the body was found. Yet, letters were being sent regularly to the man's family, listing excuses like he was traveling or had left because he didn't like the city, and these letters were written by Walsh herself. Social Security checks continued to be collected in Gilmore's name from the post office, his bank accounts were emptied, and his credit cards were used. Walsh was trying to transfer his assets to herself using fake documents in the name of her deceased fiancé. Years later, forensic examination confirmed the body belonged to Everson Gilmore. Because the body's identity couldn't be determined at the time, no action could be taken against Walsh, and she comfortably continued her plans. The poisoning of Ruth Morrison and the disposal of Everson Gilmore's body in a crate in the river were the first clear signs of Walsh's murder process. These two deaths also revealed her pattern of first emotionally incapacitating her victims, then poisoning them with drugs, and either burying them without a trace or leaving them in a remote place. And this model would be applied serially in the coming years. After being paroled from prison in 1985, Helena Walsh returned to her two-story Victorian house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento. This house would become a trap for her real plans. Walsh ostensibly acted as someone who wanted to help elderly, widowed, and destitute people. She told social workers, church volunteers, and charities that she provided shelter for low-income individuals in her home. This led state-linked aid organizations and hospitals to start referring individuals with psychological or physical disabilities to her. In this boarding house, she charged only a few $100s per person but offered food, shelter, and attention in return. In reality, Walsh's goal was to gain control of these people's social security and welfare checks issued by the state. She told new tenants that the checks sent by the state had to be handed over to her, opened bank accounts on their behalf, and often transferred these accounts to herself using fake identification documents. In documents she sent to the state, she presented herself as these individuals' legal representative, stating she would provide for their medical care and living needs. Through this system, she redirected the monthly state benefits for each tenant to her own expenses, continuing to profit without regard for their actual health conditions or states of mind. Most of the people staying in the house were individuals with alcohol addiction, a history of mental illness, or those who had severed ties with their families and were pushed to the margins of society. She relied on the fact that if these people disappeared or couldn't be contacted, no one from their immediate circle would look for them. Furthermore, any forensic investigation into the deaths of these individuals, who were regularly on medication or already struggling with health problems, could often be attributed to natural causes. Therefore, when choosing her victims, she preferred people ignored by the system, people in the shadows. She exploited their loneliness and gave the impression to the state and those around her that she cared for them. Walsh would first incapacitate her victims by gaining their trust, then give them high doses of sedatives or sleeping pills, and suffocate them when they lost consciousness. She would then either bury their bodies in the garden or, in some cases, transport them elsewhere. She often used the garden because it was controlled, easy, and the safest way to keep the bodies isolated. She prevented the bodies from being noticed by pouring concrete over them or building structures like patios, and mixed chemicals into the soil to suppress the smells. The other tenants in the house couldn't make sense of the digging in the garden, the concrete mixtures, or the heavy work noises at midnight, believing Walsh's explanations about renovations. Throughout this process, even the social workers who knew her closely had not suspected anything. On the contrary, they saw Helena as a citizen voluntarily bearing the burden of the system. In reality, 1426 F Street had become a one-way corridor of death. People went in, disappeared within a short time, and only silence remained. Every tenant who stepped into Helena Walsh's house seemed to cross an invisible boundary. Life inside could only last a few weeks before turning into the silence outside. With each new tenant, Walsh was planning the next check, the next account, the next grave. This house had taken on a structure that served the slow erasure of the poor, and nothing in this house was as it seemed. 78-year-old Leona Carpenter, who moved into the boarding house in 1987, was a lonely woman with serious health problems. Walsh gained her trust, saying she would handle her health care. She soon killed her by administering a high dose of drugs. Her body was buried in the corner of the back garden. Carpenter was one of the 3 murders for which Walsh was later tried, and the court classified her death as second-degree murder. In October of the same year, 64-year-old Dorothy Miller came to the boarding house. Miller, a former soldier, was unable to live on his own. Walsh also promised him good care. When Miller disappeared and social services officials wanted to see him, Walsh said he had moved away with his family. Months later, his body was found in the garden, covered with concrete. The autopsy revealed prescription sleeping pills and antidepressants in his system. Walsh was convicted of first-degree murder for this killing. In March 1988, 55-year-old Benjamin Fing was one of the quietest tenants in the house. Walsh isolated him from the other residents. She incapacitated him with drugs and buried his body under the patio in the garden. Months later, in response to the foul smells, Walsh told neighbors, "There's a problem with the sewage." She was also found guilty of first-degree murder for Fing's death. That same year, 78-year-old Betty Palmer suddenly disappeared after a short stay at the house. When her body was found, her head, hands, and feet had been cut off. These limbs were never found. Walsh had obtained new documents using a fake identity in Palmer's name. She had been collecting her Social Security checks for months. The jury was unable to reach a verdict for this murder, and the charges were dropped. 62-year-old James Gallup was a heart patient who had undergone brain surgery. While he needed to go to the hospital for routine checkups, Walsh canceled all his appointments, saying he had gone to Los Angeles. Months later, his body was found in the garden. Antipsychotic drugs were found in his system. Yet, due to jury deadlock, no conviction was secured for this murder. And Mavis Martin, another elderly woman who moved in October 1987. Walsh killed her shortly after and buried her in the garden. The struggle marks in the pit where Martin's body was found, the soil particles in her body, and the working watch on her arm suggested she might have been buried alive. However, this murder also did not result in a conviction. Finally, the silent murder regime Helena Walsh had built over the years began to crumble from an unexpected place in late 1988. 51-year-old Alberto Al Moreno, who had intellectual disabilities, had been placed in Walsh's boarding house with the support of Sacramento's Social Services Agency. Moreno was a man who struggled to speak and make decisions, in need of help. He was in regular communication with social worker Judy Moisant, who visited him weekly to check on his condition. After not hearing from Moreno for several weeks, Judy became worried. Walsh, with her usual calm demeanor, said Moreno had gone to stay with his family and had temporarily left the city. Judy was not satisfied with this explanation. Because Moreno had no family and was not capable of traveling on his own, Judy reported her suspicions to the authorities. On the morning of November 11, 1988, Sacramento police went to Walsh's house. Walsh received the officers extremely politely, said she would assist the investigation, and voluntarily permitted them to search the back garden. She even gave the police her own shovel. This overly cooperative attitude was a method of hiding the truth. When the initial dig in the garden uncovered a piece of human foot bone and decomposed tissue, the situation escalated very quickly. As the police deepened the excavation, 6 more different bodies emerged one by one. The remains of a total of 7 victims were found in the garden, all buried in different spots. Some bodies were covered with concrete. Some were wrapped in plastic with their mouths taped shut. One of the most chilling finds was the wristwatch, still ticking, on one of the victims. This detail suggested they might have been buried alive. The intense smell of decay from the garden indicated the bodies had been there for a long time. As the excavation continued, panic broke out in the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered around the house, the press flocked to the scene. F Street was now a crime scene. Amid all these developments, one detail was overlooked. Helena Walsh had not yet been taken into custody. She was allowed to leave the house during the excavation. Because no formal charges had been filed, and the police didn't think she would flee, Walsh left the scene, saying, "I'm going to a nearby cafe for coffee." But she never reached that cafe. That same day, she left the city, first going to Los Angeles and then moving to another area, losing her trail for 4 days. A nationwide manhunt was launched. Her photos were broadcast on television and published in newspapers. On November 16, 1988, a man chatting with Walsh in a bar in Los Angeles recognized her as the person he had seen on the TV news and called the police. Police raided the motel and arrested Walsh. When caught, she was using a new name. She had dyed her hair and changed her appearance. She was found with another intellectually disabled individual's check information, bank cards, and fake documents. This showed that even while on the run, Walsh was preparing to repeat the same criminal pattern. When she was brought back to Sacramento, she remained silent despite the dozens of cameras waiting for her in front of her house. She wore her glasses, maintaining her elderly and calm appearance. By then, her house had become a place where societal neglect was also buried, alongside the bodies. A search that began with suspicion had brought to light the fate of all those people society had ignored. and Helena Walsh was taken into custody as someone whose mask had fallen, without disrupting the role she had successfully maintained for years. After Helena Walsh was captured in Los Angeles on November 16, 1988, and extradited to Sacramento, the ensuing trial process, played out before the public eye, became a test of society's faith in the judicial system and its sense of justice. Following the 7 bodies found in her home, the prosecution brought a total of 9 murder charges against Walsh. These charges included 2 previously known missing victims whose bodies had not been found at that stage, Everson Gilmore and Ruth Morrison. Because the case was followed with great interest, the prosecution changed the venue to prevent jurors from being influenced by public opinion, and the hearings were moved to Monterey County. The process began with great preparation in the early 1990s, and the case was officially filed in late 1992. By 1993, after jury selection and the testimony process were completed, the main hearings began. The court process was extremely intense. A total of 156 witnesses were heard, hundreds of pieces of evidence were presented, and thousands of pages of documents, from autopsy reports to bank transactions, were examined. The prosecutors argued that Walsh systematically killed elderly and destitute people for financial gain, then used these individuals' social security and pension checks for her own benefit. They stated that most victims had high doses of prescription drugs in their systems, that some had their heads, hands, or legs cut off to hinder identification, that some bodies were covered in concrete, and that there was evidence some may have been buried alive. The defense argued that Walsh had a difficult childhood, witnessed violence and abuse, was stigmatized due to her past crimes, but that there was no definitive proof she directly caused these people's deaths. Her lawyers implied that some of the deaths in the house might have been from natural causes, and some might be linked to other tenants. The jury was sometimes deadlocked in the face of the weight of the evidence. After a total of 24 days of deliberation, it was the longest murder trial deliberation process in California history at that time. Ultimately, the jury found Walsh guilty of the first-degree murder of Benjamin Fing and Dorothy Miller, and of the second-degree murder of Leona Carpenter. These 3 convictions were enough to sentence her to life in prison. For the remaining 6 murder charges, the jury could not reach a consensus. Due to this deadlock, the court dropped these 6 charges. Prosecutors sought the death penalty for Walsh. However, the jury was also divided during the penalty phase. Some members opposed the death penalty, citing Walsh's age, her gender, and her past trauma. Thus, under California law, the death penalty could not be applied, and a life sentence would take effect. On December 10, 1993, Helena Walsh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility and spent the rest of her life there. Throughout the trial, she showed no remorse. She appealed the conviction and maintained her innocence. In 1998, the Court of Appeal upheld all decisions, and Walsh's sentences became final. Thus, the punishment for a years-long cold-blooded criminal organization only managed to inscribe 3 names into the judicial records. The rest were on the verge of being forgotten in the deficiency of the system. 9 bodies, 9 charges, and only 3 convictions. How much justice was truly served is still debated today, more so than by the jury of that day. Facing murder charges, Helena Walsh repeated the same sentence from the very beginning: "I only tried to help." From the moment of her arrest, Walsh, who projected the image of a quiet, elderly, and vulnerable woman in the public eye, tried to steer the entire process through this image. She did not speak to the press, remained calm during police interrogations. In court, she presented herself as a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for the elderly. Her lawyers argued that she had an abusive childhood in the 1930s, was married off young, was psychologically fragile, and was forced to live a life intertwined with crime under the guise of charity. The defense strategy tried to present her not as a full-fledged serial killer, but as a woman who made mistakes and couldn't handle the problems of the people around her. Walsh claimed most of the deaths were from natural causes. She argued that these people, whose health was already deteriorated, died from the effects of the prescription drugs they were using or from age-related complications. She said she provided them with care, gave them food, offered them a place to stay, took in individuals neglected by the state, and had no intention of killing them. She claimed most of the drugs found in her house were obtained from the elderly tenants' prescriptions, and that she only used some fake documents to make their affairs easier. The evidence that emerged, however, showed that Walsh did not just provide care. She redirected the victims' social security checks to her own name using fake documents, covered some bodies with concrete, and even tried to conceal one victim's identity by cutting off her hands and head. The prosecution claimed she acted systematically, driven purely by greed for money, and used the narrative of help only as a mask. Another notable detail in Walsh's defense was that most of the victims were individuals with no family ties and weak connections to the outside world. Walsh's lawyers said her mistake was taking on too much responsibility, trying to attribute the crimes to a kind of burnout, to overloading. But in response, the prosecution presented documents showing that after the deaths of any of the victims, no emergency health services were called, that there was interference with autopsies, and that financial transactions were initiated immediately after the deaths. The biggest inconsistency in Walsh's defense was why she buried the bodies in the garden. Unable to give a clear answer to this question, Walsh tried to explain with vague statements like, "I panicked and didn't know what to do." But the fact that each body was carefully packaged and, in some cases, covered in concrete, indicated premeditated actions. She maintained the same defense throughout her years in prison. She generally refused to give interviews but occasionally made written statements. In these statements, she said she was innocent, that the elderly trusted her, that she would never harm them, and that the media had turned her into a monster. In letters she sent to some journalists, she wrote, "I never wanted to harm anyone." All these defenses lost their effect in the face of the weight of the 7 corpses. The public and the legal system listened more to the silent bodies under the earth than to her words. Throughout the trial, she showed neither an apology nor an expression of remorse. Not only did she not confess her guilt, she did not accept any of the shocking murders. By still introducing herself as a woman trying to help, Helena Walsh revealed just how deep her denial was. She wanted to silence the truth, just like her victims. When Helena Walsh's murders came to light, the media found an iconography that would etch deeply into the public's mind: death disguised as a lovely grandmother. The 7 bodies found during the police excavation at 1426 F Street in Sacramento instantly attracted both regional and national press attention. In the early days, local newspapers covered the situation under headlines like "Elderly Tenants Mistreated," but as the body count rose, the news language hardened and the fear factor increased. Headlines like "Death House, Landlady from Hell" quickly became part of the American media's lexicon. The news was even more shocking because her gender, elderly appearance, and calm, measured speech did not fit the classic serial killer profile. Television cameras broadcast live from in front of the house for days. The crowd reacted with varying responses each time the police uncovered a new body. Some prayed, others just stared in disbelief. The house suddenly became a nationally known symbol. Some journalists described the house as the memory of the earth. Magazines like Time, Newsweek, and People prepared special features examining the societal dimensions of the event. The Los Angeles Times published a detailed biography of Walsh from her childhood, writing that she was both a product of the system and someone who exploited its gaps. International media also showed interest. TV crews from the UK, Germany, and Australia came to Sacramento for live broadcasts. The headline, "The Dark Side of the American Dream," was frequently used. Guided tours began to be organized on the street where the house was located. Some visitors took souvenir photos in front of Walsh's house. Some local businesses tried to turn this interest into a commercial opportunity. Even the new owners of the house years later explained how they had to manage the fear and curiosity created in the community by living there. When the trial process began, media interest intensified even more. Although a limited number of journalists were allowed in the courtroom, the press traffic outside continued unabated. Television channels prepared court analysis programs. Expert commentaries on the psychology of the murders were broadcast. Helena Walsh's glasses, hairstyle, and silent demeanor created a dilemma in the public between fear and curiosity. The question of what truly made her a killer was at the center of media debates. The rarity of female serial killers, the conflict between her age and appearance, associated with compassion, and her horrifying actions, transformed Walsh's story from an ordinary criminal case into a cultural phenomenon. Years later, this story continued to live on in popular culture. Channels like Discovery Channel, Oxygen True Crime, and Investigation Discovery produced documentaries about Walsh. The first episode of Netflix's Worst Roommate Ever documentary series was dedicated to her, reaching millions of viewers. A short documentary filmed in 2015, titled The House Is Not Innocent, described the tragedy left on the location from the perspective of the house's current owners. Some journalists suggested that Walsh could not have committed all the crimes alone and that some people staying in the house may have collaborated. These claims were never proven but found resonance in the media. After the event, structural problems such as the inadequacy of the social services system for the elderly, lax oversight, and lack of interagency communication began to be discussed more in public. The media prompted the questioning not only of Walsh, but of the system she operated within. At the center of the story always stood the same figure, an innocent face behind glasses, 7 bodies buried in her garden. Helena Walsh was transformed by the media from a figure into a phenomenon. She was etched into memory as a name symbolizing both the coldness of death and the shame of being deceived. The murders committed by Helena Walsh became a psychological and sociological case file debated in criminology for years. Because Walsh was an unusual example who did not fit known serial killer profiles. She was a woman, elderly, and appeared affectionate. She seemed integrated into society and had no overt history of violence. Yet, all her victims were marginalized, vulnerable, and discarded people. In this respect, Walsh was a hunter with a different orientation from classic psychopaths, also using the advantage of invisibility. When criminal psychologists assessed Walsh, they noted she largely fit the definition of classic antisocial personality disorder. Symptoms like lack of empathy, superficial emotions, an extraordinary skill for lying, a tendency for manipulation, and constant avoidance of responsibility were clearly seen in Walsh's behavior. While these symptoms can be found in ordinary criminals, Walsh's key difference was her ability to carefully conceal this entire personality structure and present herself outwardly as an affectionate, helpful, trustworthy figure. In other words, she was a high-functioning manipulator who acted a part, using her identity strategically. The number of female serial killers is much lower than males, and while most kill for emotional or relationship-based reasons, Walsh's actions, almost entirely motivated by material gain and devoid of emotion, made her statistically unusual as well. The fact that all her victims were elderly, lonely, disabled, or socially excluded individuals shows she ran a pragmatic and conscienceless selection process. They were individuals no one would look for, question, whose silence had become part of the system. For Walsh, these people were merely social security checks, pension payments, and fake identity opportunities. While some criminologists argued that the severe abuse she experienced in childhood, her orphanage trauma, and early abandonment experiences laid the groundwork for her later personality disorder, the fact that such pasts do not always lead to violence and that Walsh committed crimes through conscious actions weakens this defense. Because Walsh made plans, forged documents, concealed the moments of death, systematically packaged and buried bodies, and more importantly, never showed remorse. Her continued self-portrayal as a victim, even in written interviews from prison, suggests that denial was an integral part of her personality structure. Psychiatrists noted her tendency towards mythomania, pathological lying, that she didn't recognize the line between truth and falsehood, and that she eventually came to believe her own fabricated narrative. Another notable feature was Walsh's skill in using social roles. A devout woman, a charitable citizen, a compassionate landlady, a calm grandmother. They were all layers she used to hide her true self. In this respect, some experts defined her as a functional psychopath. Because she superficially conformed to social norms, pretended to recognize rules, but used this entire process only as a stage for her own benefit. With this profile, Walsh was not someone who could be defined in the classical sense as a monster. She was an individual who emerged from within the system, saw its gaps and exploited them, who could walk without confusing crime and morality, and who lacked empathy. So the answer to the question, was she a psychopath or a victim, was very clear to most experts. Walsh may have suffered in the past, but she was not a victim. She was a cold-blooded killer who used the pain of her past as a mask, who walked towards the center of crime through her own choices, who buried her victims one by one in the soil, without knowing them, without pity, with the silence of the system at her back. Helena Walsh was 64 years old when she was sentenced to life in prison in 1993. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility, the largest prison for women in California. During the approximately 18 years she spent there, she never admitted her guilt, never showed remorse, and never accepted responsibility in any statement reflected in the media. The prison administration described her as a quiet, rule-abiding inmate who didn't get into fights. But she also projected a profile of being introverted, avoiding emotional bonds with other inmates, and occasionally still believing she was misunderstood. Over the years, she agreed to give interviews by corresponding with some journalists. In these letters, she still described herself as a well-intentioned woman who opened her doors to people in need. She said the deaths happened from natural causes, that she had to bury the bodies because she was afraid people would blame her. But even between the lines she wrote, the tendency to blame others, denial, and manipulation were clearly visible. For her, death did not come with a confession or confrontation. On the contrary, it ended quietly, ordinarily, and almost invisibly. On March 27, 2012, at the age of 82, she died of natural causes in prison. There was no dramatic end, nor did it create a major echo in society. Her death was almost silent compared to the echo of the lives buried by her hands years earlier. Most of her victims were nameless, family-less individuals erased from societal memory. Walsh's death, in contrast, made headlines once more: "Death House Landlady Dies." The news published under this headline emphasized her years of silence, her dying without confessing her guilt, and the fact that some murders remained unsolved. Some journalists wrote that this silent death was a kind of escape, that justice had never truly been fully served. The house where Walsh lived changed hands years later. The new owners restored the house, painted the walls, tried to erase the traces of the past. But for everyone who knows that address, that house has become a monument to societal neglect, invisible lives, and the crimes a woman committed in the shadows. Even today, some visitors going to Sacramento pause to see the house, look at the garden, and listen to the soil shrouded in silence. There are no more corpses there, nor Walsh, but some stories continue to speak even after being buried. Helena Walsh's story is one of those silent ones, eternally echoing, like a confession rising from beneath the earth that cannot be silenced.